Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty unique.
Oh, yeah. What do we got?
Well, it's an assessment that comes from an AI, specifically Claude Sonnet 4, talking about its own skills, or lack thereof, when it comes to helping fiction writers.
Ah, okay. Interesting. So not us reviewing the AI, but the AI reviewing itself.
Exactly. What does it think it can actually do for writers? And just as importantly, where does it admit, hey, I can't do this?
That's a fascinating angle, getting the machine's perspective on its own place in the creative process.
Right. So our mission today is to really dig into this self-assessment. We want to pull out the key things it claims, its strengths, its weaknesses.
And figure out what that actually means for you if you're a writer thinking about these tools, or even just thinking about the craft itself.
We're aiming to give you the most important insights from this source, straight from the AI's metaphorical mouth.
Okay, let's do it. Where does it start? What does it claim it's good at?
It kicks off with its strengths, naturally, the areas it thinks it really shines.
Makes sense. And the first one is?
Pattern recognition and analysis. That's the big headline.
Okay, pattern recognition. What does that look like for a writer?
Well, the AI claims it can process just huge amounts of text, like vast libraries worth.
Right.
And quickly spot the underlying techniques. Why certain narrative tricks work, how good pacing builds tension, how effective dialogue sounds.
So it's like it's read everything and can say, the way you revealed that clue, that matches patterns I've seen in successful mysteries. Or maybe
you're pacing here in the middle. It's lagging compared to novels that maintain reader engagement. It also mentions spotting inconsistencies.
Inconsistencies like plot holes or character actions.
Yeah, exactly. Stuff a writer might miss because they're just too deep in the weeds. Character motivations that don't quite track, pacing issues. It frames it as getting that objective, experienced reader's view, but super fast.
Okay, that speed and scope, I can see how that could be useful. Like a very, very well-read beta reader for structural stuff. What's next on its list of strengths?
It talks about systematic thinking, about craft.
Systematic thinking. How does that apply to something as, sometimes messy as writing?
It suggests it can take those concepts we talk about, like show, don't tell, or raising the stakes concepts that can feel a bit abstract.
Yeah, they can be hard to pin down sometimes.
And it breaks them down. It tries to turn them into, analyzable components.
Can you give an example? Like, if a scene feels flat.
Exactly the kind of thing it mentions. If a scene feels flat, the AI might analyze it and suggest, okay, maybe the internal conflict for the character is missing here, or this character feels one-dimensional because their goals seem only surface level, with no deeper motivation shown.
I see. So it tries to put a technical label on that gut feeling of something's wrong here.
Right. Helping the writer maybe understand the mechanics behind why it feels off so they can potentially fix it structurally.
Interesting. It's trying to translate intuition into craft terms. What else?
Following on from that, there's the objective reader perspective.
Okay, we touched on that with pattern spotting, but how does it elaborate here?
It really emphasizes that it doesn't have the writer's history or, emotional investment in the story.
It only sees the words on the page.
Precisely. So it claims it's good at noticing when something you think is super clear in your head. Well, it hasn't actually made it onto the page effectively for a reader.
That classic writer blind spot, but I know what I meant.
Exactly. Or it might point out that a big plot twist feels kind of random or unearned because the earlier setup, the groundwork, just isn't there in the text.
Yeah, that lack of bias could be valuable for catching those gaps. Okay, what about knowledge base?
That's another one, crush genre knowledge. It claims it can pull insights and techniques from all over the literary map.
Meaning?
Like, it could analyze how suspense is built in Gothic horror, or how character interiority is handled in modern literary fiction, or how world building works in epic fantasy.
And then suggest how you might apply a technique from one genre to solve a problem in another.
That's the idea it puts forward. It mentions drawing on different time periods, cultures, genres, basically using its huge data set to make connections you might not think of.
Like a massive searchable library of narrative strategies. Could be useful for brainstorming, I suppose. Any other big strengths?
The last one it highlights is detailed feedback and development.
As opposed to just vague comments.
Yeah, it stresses that it aims for specific, actionable advice. So instead of just saying, your character feels flat, it might analyze why and suggest, consider giving them a hidden contradiction. Or strengthen their voice by using more fragmented sentences here, based on patterns it sees.
So getting into the nitty-gritty of how to potentially improve things, not just that they need improving.
That's the claim. Focused on concrete suggestions tied to craft elements.
Okay, so those are the strengths: analysis, systematic thinking, objectivity, broad knowledge, and detailed feedback. Sounds pretty impressive on paper.
It does, but then the source pivots pretty hard to the limitations. And it explicitly calls them significant. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Right, because this is where the AI acknowledges what it can't do, and what's top of that list.
The absolute biggest one it identifies is no authentic emotional experience.
Ah, that feels like the core difference, doesn't it?
It really does. The AI is very clear. It can analyze text for patterns associated with emotional impact. It can see how language, imagery, plot points are used in stories that readers find moving.
But it doesn't feel anything itself. It doesn't know grief or joy or love or anger from the inside.
Exactly. It lacks that lived conscious experience. It can recognize the linguistic patterns of sadness, maybe, but it hasn't been sad.
And the implication for writers, according to the AI,
it means it fundamentally can't judge if your writing will create a genuine, resonant, emotional connection with a human reader. It can only check if it matches structural patterns.
And it can't help the writer tap into their own emotional truth, which is often where the most powerful writing comes from.
Right. That's a huge gap, and it owns up to it.
Yeah.
What other limitations does it mention?
It talks about a limited understanding of voice and style.
Okay, how so? It can analyze style, surely.
It can analyze the technical bits, yes, word choice frequency, sentence length variation, stuff like that. But it admits that a truly unique authorial voice, well, that comes from personality, worldview, life experience.
Things an AI doesn't have. Yeah. Voice isn't just technique, it's the person behind the words.
That's the essence of it. The AI notes its own tendency towards clear analytical prose and basically says it can't really help you develop a voice that's, say, deeply experimental or quirky or intimate because it doesn't have the self that fuels such a voice.
Makes sense. What about the actual act of creation, the process?
Another big one. Inability to experience creative breakthrough.
Those aha moments.
Exactly. Those times when a character suddenly does something unexpected that feels absolutely right, or a plot solution just appears out of nowhere. The AI says, I can't do that.
Because its output is based on analyzing existing data, not spontaneous inspiration.
Right. It synthesizes and analyzes. It doesn't have those flashes of genuine surprise or discovery that are often so central to the creative process for humans. It can't replicate that feeling of the story taking on a life of its own.
Wow, okay, that's another fundamental difference. Are there others?
Yes, cultural and experiential blind spots. This is important.
Meaning its training data limits its worldview.
Pretty much. It acknowledges that its perspective is shaped by the massive but still finite and potentially biased data set it learned from. So it might completely miss subtle cultural nuances, specific generational viewpoints, or the textures of lived experiences that are vital for authentic characters and settings.
Especially, I imagine, if you're writing about communities or experiences that aren't heavily represented in mainstream literature or online text.
Precisely. The source warns that its feedback in those areas might be generic or potentially even misleading because it lacks that deep, specific understanding.
That's a critical point for writers aiming for authentic representation. What else? You mentioned the process earlier.
Yes, a really practical one. No understanding of the writing process itself from the human side.
Like writer's block.
Yeah.
The emotional ups and downs.
All of that. It doesn't get blocked. It doesn't feel the despair of a difficult draft or the thrill of finishing a chapter. It doesn't understand the need for motivation, how to handle rejection, how your personal life inevitably spills into your writing time and energy.
Which is, let's be honest, half the battle for most writers. Just navigating the human side of sitting down and doing the work.
Exactly. And the AI says, I can't help you with any of that. It doesn't compute the psychological reality of being a writer.
Okay. Any final limitations?
One more, which is kind of the flip side of its strength, a tendency toward overanalysis.
Meaning its systematic approach could be too much.
Potentially, yeah. For writers who work more intuitively, who rely on feeling their way through a story, the AI's constant focus on technical breakdown and analysis might actually stifle their process. It could, as the source suggests, kind of suck the life out of a more organic approach.
Interesting. So it might interfere with certain creative styles.
That's the potential risk it flags.
Okay, so we have this detailed picture now. Powerful analysis on one hand, but huge gaps in emotion, voice, creativity, culture, and understanding the human writer on the other.
That's the self-assessment it provides, very clearly delineated.
So let's synthesize this. Based on its own assessment, where does this AI think it's actually most valuable for a writer?
It positions itself primarily as a craft consultant and a superpowered analytical reader.
Best used when?
The source really points towards the revision stages. After you've got a draft down, that's when its ability to provide objective feedback on structure, on pacing, on plot consistency, character arcs, clarity. That's where it sees its sweet spot.
So less for generating the initial spark, more for polishing the engine.
That seems to be the idea, helping you refine the technical execution. It also suggests it can help you, the writer, develop your own analytical skills for self-editing, like a workout partner for your critical eye.
A systematic sounding board for diagnosing technical problems.
Oh.
Okay, but where does it absolutely insist you need humans?
It's very explicit here. For developing your unique, authentic voice, for accessing and conveying genuine emotional truth, for understanding and portraying deep cultural nuances accurately, and for navigating the whole psychological journey of being a writer.
For all of that, it points away from itself.
Yes. It essentially says you need human mentors, critique partners, writing groups, beta readers, and, crucially, your own lived experience and emotional landscape. Those human elements are irreplaceable, according to the AI itself.
So the bottom line from the AI's perspective is, use me as a specific tool for analysis, especially in revision.
But do not mistake me for a collaborator who understands the heart of storytelling, or the heart of the storyteller. It's a tool, maybe a powerful one for certain jobs, but just one tool in the box.
It really emphasizes that it's an analytical coach, maybe, but not a fellow writer sharing the struggle.
A very clear distinction it makes itself.
All right, so we've journeyed through this AI's own self-assessment, its view of its analytical strengths, and its very human limitations.
We've seen its claims about pattern recognition, systematic craft analysis, objective reading.
And balance that with its admissions about lacking emotion, true voice, creative spark, cultural depth, and any understanding of the writer's actual life and process.
The core message seems to be valuable for technical analysis, particularly in revision, but fundamentally unable to replicate or replace the human elements that make fiction truly connect.
Human connection, emotional depth, cultural insight, that unique personal stamp, those remain firmly in the human domain, according to this source.
Which in itself is quite a statement coming from the AI.
It really is. And it leaves us with a final thought to chew on, something maybe implied by this whole self-assessment.
Go on.
If an AI like this claims it can get so good at breaking down the mechanics of story, the structure, the patterns, the technical elements, what is its own admission that it still can't capture authentic emotion or voice or creative surprise? Tell us.
What does it tell us about us, about human storytelling?
Yeah, what is that essential spark, the uniquely human magic it acknowledges it can't replicate? Something for you to ponder as you think about your own writing and what makes it human.